Welcome, or welcome back, my friends. I'm Doug Pratt, and I'll be leading you in this episode of the Life Academy as we move into part 2 of our study of the Gospel in Miniature, the book of Ephesians, chapters 1 through 3. In the last episode, we were introduced to this short book. Although the copy that has been passed down to us today through the centuries is specifically addressed to the saints or believers in Christ who are in Ephesus, we have strong reason to believe that these words were written to be copied and shared among all the churches that the Apostle Paul served. The reason is that, other than the address in verse 1 of chapter 1, there are no personal references at all to individuals Paul knew or knew about. And this is unique to Paul's letters because the others all include some local greetings or references. And this is especially surprising because Paul spent over 2 years in the large and bustling city of Ephesus, located near the Aegean coast in what is today Turkey. So most likely, this short letter or introduction to Christian theology was hand-copied and readdressed to many churches, Corinth, Philippi, Smyrna, etc., and then was delivered personally through couriers sent by Paul from his house arrest in Rome. Having provided abundant assurance to his readers in chapter 1 of the massive and positive spiritual benefits that all who believe in Christ have already and will receive, what we call the gospel or good news, the tone of the letter changes dramatically as he transitions to chapter 2. To put it bluntly, Paul slaps them in the face with the bad news. There are times when it is necessary for us to receive bad news. Why? Because if true, bad news is what motivates us to change and to action. If a cancer or other serious illness is growing inside a person, it is essential that the doctor communicate that bad news clearly and forcefully. It is only through knowing the bad diagnosis that a patient would choose to accept the necessary medicine or chemotherapy or surgery. Telling a person they are healthy in order to be positive, when in fact they are not, is no favor to them. If a football coach assures his players the night before a big rivalry game that the other team is weak and helpless and nothing to fear, the players may sleep soundly that night, but they will not be prepared to play their best the following day. Would you rather receive the bad news or the good news first? The bad news, you have a disease. The good news, there is a drug or treatment to cure it. The good news, your 17-year-old son is unhurt. The bad news, your BMW is totaled. Which would you want to get first? Well, Paul does it in both ways. In his larger description of the Christian message in the book of Romans, he leads off with the bad news. Following a few words of introduction, Romans 1 verse 18 gets right to the point. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness. And after several chapters of this bad news, Romans then moves into a full description of good news. In Ephesians, as we saw during the last episode, the opening words are filled with positive reassurance about all our blessings in Christ. But now he turns to the bad news in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. You were dead through the trespasses and sins in which you once lived, following the course of this world, following the ruler of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work among those who are disobedient. All of us once lived among them in the passions of our flesh, following the desires of flesh and senses, and we were by nature children of wrath, like everyone else. The accurate diagnosis from Paul, the doctor of our souls, is very sobering. You were dead through trespasses and sins. Our spiritual condition, in other words, is terminal. We are all separated from God. Verses 2 and 3 identify what have been identified by Christian teachers for centuries as the three great enemies of the soul, the three sources of the temptations and corruptions that all people have fallen victim to: the world, the devil, and the flesh. World in this context does not mean the natural world of grass and trees and oceans and sky. It is the influence of other human beings in our societies that tempt and lure us away from God. Satan is the spirit at work in human beings. Our flesh is not our physical bodies, but our desires, impulses, and corrupted emotions. The deadly seriousness of our spiritual condition is summarized using the same dire term that Paul used in Romans. We were children of wrath, like everyone else. Well, let's take a moment to think about the true meaning of this term, the wrath of God. The most common connotation in contemporary English for wrath is an uncontrolled, violent, vengeful explosion of temper. We think of a person with unrestrained rage, perhaps a man coming home drunk one night who strikes his wife when she asks if he's been drinking, or a driver who is cut off in traffic, reaches into his glove box for a gun and then fires at the other car in road rage. Well, that seems to be so much the opposite of God as Jesus revealed him. How could God have a wrath like that? The answer is that this wrath is not emotional or out of control. It is defined in Romans more fully as righteous judgment. When American and British military judges convened the war crimes trial in Nuremberg after the surrender of Germany, they had to struggle with very human emotions of rage and fury as they watched films of the liberation of the Nazi death camps and heard of the horrors of the Holocaust. Their instinctive reactions were to want to lash out at the evil men standing before them, but those judges made a commitment to themselves and to one another to be completely non-emotional and dispassionate. They would only dispense pure and righteous judgment on those who were truly criminals. In the same way, God's judgment of the terrible sins of the human race is righteous. And if the story ended there, none of us could claim that we had been innocent. But beginning in verse 4, Paul now turns to the best possible good news. He described in chapter 1 the results of this good news or gospel, but here he tells us the reason for it. But God, who is rich in mercy, out of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead through our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the ages to come he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are what he has made us, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand to be our way of life. God has chosen to offer us the opposite of what we all deserve, and he has done so out of a mercy that is even greater than his righteous wrath. To return to the analogy that we are all in spiritual terminal condition, the only possible cure for our fatal illness of sin has been given us. He has made us alive even when we were dead. This is an act of grace. Grace is something we have not and can never earn, deserve, pay for, or even reimburse. More than that, we have been raised up and seated in the spiritual dimension, meaning that we now can experience a personal relationship with God. Verses 8 and 9 are so fundamental to the Christian gospel that they are worth repeating and then unpacking. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one may boast. Because it has proven to be so common for humans to miss this great truth, let's make it very simple. Think of this as an equation or formula. Here is the incorrect way to understand it. Faith plus works equals salvation. We'll use F plus W equals S. This was the mistake of the legalistic Jews of the Old Testament era. And it is a mistake that people continue to make today. By works, Paul means doing good things, things in keeping with God's law. If our actions could in some way earn our relationship with God, then we would have something to boast about. But verses 8 and 9 make it abundantly clear that the correct formula for receiving God's blessing is F equals S. Faith alone is salvation. But Paul doesn't stop there, for he immediately follows it with verse 10. For we are created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand to be our way of life. In other words, the full and complete equation is this: F equals S plus W. Faith equals salvation plus works. The works of obedience that God has called us to do are to be done not to earn salvation, but as a response to salvation. They belong not on the left side of the formula, but the right. We don't obey out of any illusion that in doing so we qualify for His grace, but out of gratitude to that grace, we are motivated to want to live in ways that please God. There's one more thing we need to notice in these powerful words of chapter 2, which encapsulate so simply but clearly the bad news and the good news. Verse 5 tells us that God made us alive. We did not resuscitate ourselves. It was His work. And then verse 8 reaffirms this order. It was God's grace that saved us through our faith. His grace came first. One of the foundational principles of the Reformed faith, which flowed out of the great Protestant Reformation over 500 years ago with its rediscovery of the Bible's central teachings on salvation, is this three-word declaration: regeneration precedes faith. Regeneration means to make alive. That's what God does in us. And it is His work of making us alive that allows us to then have faith in Him. We do not first choose God, and then He makes us alive or born again. Rather, He changes our hearts by His grace. And because of that, we are able to have the faith that brings us salvation. We will pause there, hopefully leading us to ponder this great truth of the good news that has overcome the bad news. We will complete chapter 2 and all of chapter 3 in the next episode of The Gospel in Miniature.